Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on climate change. The session is from petition to policy, turning climate evidence into action. Ishita and I will be talking about climate change today. Ishita, can you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Ishita. I am currently pursuing a master's in international law, focusing on environment law, and I've been working in climate justice space for last 7 to 8 years. My interest in climate change law is from an intersectional lens to understand how it disproportionately impact certain communities in certain countries, and how to when we are planning combating climate change, what measures to take in to consider the marginalized communities. Navi, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah. So I'm Navy. I am currently doing masters in literature, and I have been passionate about climate change for a long time, and I'm just glad to have this opportunity to talk to you about this and maybe learn more. So I'll quickly just introduce APNA. APNA is Association for Parivartan of Nation. It's a non-profit organization in Jharkhand that helps marginalized people exercise their legal rights and convert them into real life, not just on paper. They make sure that the marginalized groups are included and they have their rights and they are active parts of the community. um, their most important project is Project 21A, which supports children's rights, quality education, making sure that families are aware of their rights under the Right to Education Act 2009. APNA also works on gender justice, women's right, access to education and healthcare. I work for the PLP RAP under APNA. PLP RAP is a special project that helps share stories, experiences from local community, social workers, grassroots organizations in Jharkhand. Um, and it's basically documentation of these ideas and these resources. And I work on APNA's reports and make them into blogs for their website. Ishita, would you like to introduce what climate change is?
Yes, I would love to. So, climate change, while it's a very natural process that climate changes, why it is a particular concern is because the human activity has started causing adverse impact on climate patterns, uh, which scientists have mapped throughout the history of humankind. And what that is doing is that the greenhouse emissions, primarily caused by um, oil and by CO2 released in extraction of oil, or release of CO2 due to large scale carbon emissions. What that does is that it traps heat in the atmosphere, causing heat waves and causing adverse global warming impact, which changes the weather pattern as well as changes the climate as a whole over the ages. So, as you would feel, the climate around you has changed so much since you were born, and it's not in a normal way. It is getting adverse over the years. So so a normal way to see it is that it's not just warming the temperature, it is creating weather patterns which are more extreme for humans and animals to sustain, and it changes the ecology of the nature.
Yeah. Um, and the advent of industrialization in the 1800s started climate change by humans. Like it was always there. Climate change is something that's natural, something that happens due to volcanic eruptions, due to sun's rays and its heat. But it came into intense pressure. The planet came under intense pressure after human activity, and fossil fuels generate greenhouse gas emissions that blanket the earth and trap the sun's heat and raise the temperature. Do you want to talk about the Paris Agreement?
Yes. Paris Agreement is not the first agreement that talked about climate change. There were agreements before, but that was something that everybody agreed on a scientific consensus that 1.5 degrees Celsius um, dash 2 or more are going to impact us adversely, and there would not be any going back. And we are already above 1.5. So the issue is like we are already in the irreversible pathway of going before 1.5 degrees before globalization. So the idea was that through Paris Agreement, states agreed that they are going to voluntarily decide how they want to contribute and how much, as per their capacity, they want to contribute in reducing greenhouse emissions and keep it under 1.5 degrees. So, say if you are a country A, you decide on your capacities how much A can do. And why Paris Agreement became such a huge success is because it was voluntary in nature. Nobody from the outside, in like in Kyoto, is going to tell you that this is how much you need to do or this is the plan that we need to follow. So it gives huge flexibility to states to determine how much they want to contribute, which are called NDCs under the Paris Agreement, that you can decide. But the issue in this is that because it's so flexible, it g- gives states the leeway to do as little as they want, and this creating a space in which states are not aiming for higher and everybody's looking for somebody else to do more. So if in the example that I was giving, you are state A, you would think, okay, there's state B, C, D, and others who can decide to do more. Maybe do you want to share?
Right. So I feel like it's what you said is absolutely right. And there's also judgment and prejudice against developing nations, because developed nations feel like you are emitting more carbon, you are adding to the footprint, and you are responsible for what's happening. Whereas they did it before, and they have a lot of their factories, a lot of their waste comes to underdeveloped countries, and it's not properly disposed of, it's not properly managed, and obviously there's not that many regulations. So it's not really on the underdeveloped countries how this blame game is like played.
That is absolutely right. When we're talking about developed and developing country, while there is a principle which is CBDRC, which deals with common but differentiated responsibility on states. So it was founded on the assumption that because the developed states have emitted so much that is causing the global emissions that are caused today, and the climate impact that it has, the issue is that the developed states agree to provide finances and take responsibility for the emissions that they have made. The finances are also in forms of loan. So there was an Oxfam report in 2024 that actually showed that today the global south is giving more money in terms of interest, more than how much they got as money from the developed state or the global north to to sponsor under CBDR, because most of these loans are not grants, but the finances are mostly in forms of loans and not grants. So the financial burden is also on the global south.
Yeah. So because Africa is often like not, you know, something that is focused on, people don't really care about what's happening there. I would like to talk about Africa and DRC and climate change through the mining of cobalt. Do you know about this, Ishita? Do you have something to add before I start?
No, you can continue and then I can add on the way.
Sure. So the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, has world's largest reserves of cobalt. Cobalt is a component that's used in lithium ion batteries, used in electric vehicles for renewable energy storage systems as well. Um, so, according to 2023 Critical Minerals Market Review by International Energy Agency (IEA), the demand for lithium tripled, and that of cobalt and nickel rose by 70 and 40% from 2017 to 2022. So, a lot of ecological impacts are being faced by lithium mining in Africa. um, there's obviously an environmental footprint during operations, and post closure also shows that there's vegetation clearing, there's open cut mining, there's drilling of materials, processing, storage facilities, and all of these add to climate change because drilling induces like a state where there's too much dust and people have respiratory risks that they face on site and in nearby communities. And hard rock lithium mining basically involves clearing several hectares of vegetation, which includes which results in like a loss of biodiversity. These forests are major carbon sinks, like they store carbon that the world really needs right now, and they just basically cut down these forests and storage for the planet, and climate change happens.
I think I love the example that you have taken, and it is very relevant to show that who has the burden. If you're talking about states adopting electric vehicles and ad- asking people to switch to electric vehicles, while taking away the primary role of state, which is to provide affordable public transportation. It is not for people to switch to electric vehicles, but you to find ways that people can transport from one place to another in the most carbon efficient way. And what this cycle does is that the burden is further on the global south to mine their natural resources, and in these the place that you mentioned and the extraction of lithium, it is done in adverse human rights violating circumstances. The workers are not paid well. The extraction is actually extracting natural resources and impacting the ecology in the global south, to for benefit of whom? The global north and the rich people in global south. The most vulnerable communities are adversely impacted to then benefit these um the the global north and the elites in global south, which just does not make sense, that these were the people in first place that caused the global emissions that have led us to the place that we are. And now the burden is also not on them. The burden is still on the global south, and what they will show is that, oh, but we are paying for the natural resources, but the impact that, as you mentioned, the emissions and the ecology, the forests that store the carbon, all of that when it is all released and when this whole ecology is impacted, this is not reversible. Even if you reforest, you can't have the ecology that existed there before. So the impact is everlasting.
Right. Do you want to give other examples or talk about the petition to policy part of the talk?
We can talk about the petition to policy part, yeah. I think this example
All right.
correctly covers what we are trying to show.
Okay. Shall we start with the SDGs, UN conventions? We already covered the Paris Agreement.
Yeah,
Would you like to introduce them?
yeah, sure. So when we're talking about sustainable development goals, those are like wider goals that states adopt through different policies. And a policy can have different goals that they are covering, but it is the idea of sustainable development goals is to not ask states to not develop or not like leave behind in development, but to develop in such a way that you take care of key elements of sustainability. So those elements include water rights for all, gender equality, and these are very wider goals, but they all come around in sort of har- harmonizing how development should take care of the most vulnerable, and it should promote climate justice.
Um, Also, in the UN, the influence that the developing nations have is very little because countries like US are the major funders. So their it's not very inclusive for them, and their research ideas and their outputs for implementing policy into practice, it's often ignored. So would you like to elaborate on that?
So, first, the categorization of developing and developed has this notion: developed according to whom, developing according to whom. So, there's a standard of development that states have been put into, and then you have to reach some place to where you would be seen as them. So, today scholars have classified this as more of global south and global north to indicate that global north are the so-called developed states which have much more resource, as you said, political influence and capacity to regulate law. And if beyond this, if we even see whose laws exist as laws in international law, those are not the marginalized community, indigenous community, or the global south. Those are the major players from the global north. It is Eurocentric. It is um, even when you talk about major lawmaking, who are the negotiators, who are the mediators, and who are forming the baseline of a framework before it is consulted with the global community. So per se, the UN does, at least UNGA does have voting rights for everybody, but the implementing part of it, and that is the Security Council, who imposes um, who imposes financial restrictions, has veto rights, which are from global north, except for China. And it is also debated that is China the right representative when we're talking about the global south or the developing states.
Okay. Could you elaborate on why China wouldn't be a good representative for the global south?
So when we're talking about climate change specifically, I'm not talking about the political, human rights, or any other aspects of China. I'm just referring to China for talking about climate change. That China's emissions have in current times have overpowered the historic difference that it had. So for a state to be global south or global north, or as you said, like developing or developed, the emissions need to be lower than certain level to consider them. In case of India or other countries, the point is that their historic emissions were so low that even if right now they are high because of the population and because that they are developing. But in case of China, it has overpowered its own historic emissions difference, and it is more than any other country to account for. So, is that the right representation for Global South in Security Council to talk about climate change or environmental justice?
All right. Um, I read a very interesting article while I was researching for this talk. It's on, so it basically distinguished between SDA, science driven approach, and knowledge co production. And I'm just going to quickly talk about what these are. Science driven approach is basically predicted by the experts and the decision makers who view science as objective, value free, and apolitical. So they tend to conflate, as in like mix research with evidence, and they ignore the social and value context for them. it basically follows a linear model which assumes that knowledge directly and rationally is linked to policy making. And on the other hand, we have knowledge co-production, which says that knowledge is not value free. It is created through social practices, meaning making, and political negotiation. And it brings together various actors to achieve legitimate, actionable, and contextually appropriate knowledge, like individuals, communities, and governments. Uh, but there is a criticism for both. The criticism for SDA is that no matter what the evidence is, if you are not including the politics, then the leaders can have their own perspectives, their own cultural views, and they can integrate them into the policies. And the criticism for knowledge co-production is that not all voices are equal, and there's institutional inertia, and the political context shape the knowledge and how it's influential. So, Ishita, would you like to add something to it?
Yeah, I think this is a good consideration when you're talking about policy making, that which one do you focus on in case of when, like, we can take the example of Paris Agreement. It was amalgamation of two. It was states coming together because they had scientific knowledge present to state whatever Paris Agreement was stating. And then there was political will to negotiate and to come down to certain things that the states agreed to create knowledge. But the current existing climate change model is extremely carbon centric, and it talks about carbon as in a commodity. If you take the example of Antara or other carbon emission trading systems that are coming in the world, what they are in the end doing is they are leaving out the justice aspect of it, as you said, like the political, social, and what political, ignoring what political, social, and cultural relevance is. It creates this idea of a system without acknowledging what justice is, and without taking in account for the major principles of understanding justice and seeing justice in our policy.
What do you think of crowd-funded projects that help um, fight climate change through like planting trees or something? Like in Spain, there is Singular Green, a private company, which obviously asks for public funding from European Union, and they basically create green shades, vegetated awnings covering in vegetation built in streets, terraces, squares to aid the cooling and absorption of CO2 and NOx, improving air quality.
While this is a great method to engage the community, understand climate change, and recognize the where it's coming from, what it really, like, we can have individual initiatives, we can have initiatives that are centric on plantation, but it cannot replace the forests. It cannot replace the large scale deforestation that takes place. And um, individual initiatives also need to center. Um, okay. Individual initiatives also need to center to these spaces. Do you want to start talking about the petition and the policy aspect of it?
Yeah, sure. Would you like to start?
Yeah. I think petition and policy plays a major role when we are talking about um, climate change, because climate action is not centered to a state or a region. It is something that every human being is going through. So policy requires consultation of communities which are going to be adversely impacted, and if that does not happen, we see the policies like EIA amendment that took place. Um, and there has been a lot of backlash, and it was taken back. But the point is that policies need to be consulted with the community. If that does not happen, it will result in large scale litigation. Um, and those litigation could be from corporates who do not have convenience through the policy, or it could also be from communities that are adversely impacted. So litigation in those ways become a bridge um, to where policy could not fit in, or what policy failed to do. But it can also be seen from the other way around. If there is an issue in a community where litigations are filed, that can be a motivating factor, or that can be a space where policies are then made to cater to the communities that are adversely impacted by the policy gap. So I think policy and litigation cannot be separated to be like, okay, policy is going to solve climate change, or litigation is going to solve it. But these two models need to be centered to the needs of marginalized communities and keep environment at the center. Like what these at the moment is doing is putting how we can continue the exploitation development that we were doing, but cover it in green paper and say that, oh, we are we are making a lot of change, we have come so far. But the carbon centric model then leaves out on justice aspect, that then climate change is adversely impacting communities that are vulnerable to climate change more than the others.
Also, how do you think marginalized communities can come together and find litigations? Like, what's the process and how can they, you know,
Mm.
be united in there?
It varies from region to region, place to place, when we are talking about communities coming together. And when we are talking about communities coming together and filing a case, we do need advocates on ground who are ready to support such litigation. We do need more environmental advocates. And even the advocates that are there and who are working for marginalized communities, their FCRA license is taken away. So their funding is restricted. So, what is FCRA license? That advocates work in for through NGOs and through um, to apply for grants, because they are not representing large giants to get funding. They are representing the marginalized community that might not have the resources to support the litigation. And how do you get good lawyers to then come and work for communities if there's lack of financial security? So in those cases, they form NGOs, or they form groups to then crowdfund or fund themselves. And some of those also get funding from, as you mentioned earlier as well, from EU funding, or it could be from any other funding space. So government give FCRA license to that lets NGOs get these fundings. And if you are an environmental defender, your FCRA license can be taken away very easily, because state discourages advocates uh, to engage with marginalized communities, stand for their rights, and that does create a huge barrier in terms of how you view climate justice, and how you encourage people to be part of this and support the communities that need it the most. But the process is largely through, it could be starting with RTI, but it can right to information to what is happening. So this becomes then the core evidence in cases when you go forward. And then it can also lead to public interest litigation if large scale community is impacted.
I think it's the follies of capitalism due to which we face these issues and the corruption. But I think, yeah, this was a good talk. Thank you for being here, Ishita. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you, Navy.
You guys have any concluding thoughts that you would want to say or give within the last 2 minutes?
Maybe I've talked a lot. You should go.
Okay, just to recap a bit, I think, like you said, global south is disproportionately affected by issues, and they don't really have the say or the resources to combat climate change, and global north is not doing a lot about it. And we need to fight this injustice. We need to hold them accountable for what's been happening, and we need to see what we can do to change. Like, obviously the 1.5 degree Celsius limit has been passed. Like, there's not much we can do about that, but we can still control the temperatures and make sure it doesn't go to levels where humans cannot live. And that's something that's important right now, and it's a very major issue. And I think policymakers or institutions, communities, individuals should all focus on what's happening right now.
Yeah.